Hello, everybody, and welcome to Entirely Too Much Talking, the podcast where I just kind of keep on going. You can all call me Ender, my pronouns are they, them, and I do a lot of wiki walks. And then when that doesn't scratch the hyperfixation itch, I tend to just start going through the relevant sources, as one does. Anyways, I have a wide variety of interests, really enjoy info dumping, and I've decided to make that everybody's problem. I am absolutely going to wander into some more obscure topics further down the line, but figured I'd kick off my first episode with something pretty much everybody has heard of before. Today we're going to be talking about Mount Everest. Disclaimer, I am not a certified expert. This is just a hobby. I should not be considered a figure of any serious authority on the subject, and I apologize in advance for any names I might be pronouncing incorrectly. Mount Everest is, obviously, the tallest mountain in the world, and as a result, also one of the most famous. About 6,000 people have reached its summit, many of them repeatedly, and despite the yearly death toll, the mountain has become a hotbed of complete amateurs looking to reach the summit for bragging rights. But getting to the summit used to be an incredibly difficult task. In 1953, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay became the first people ever to successfully reach the summit. But this came over a century after it had been confirmed as the tallest mountain in the world, and over 30 years after mountaineers began working to reach the summit. Come listen to me info dump about it for an unreasonably long amount of time. Part 1. We all owe George Everest an apology. Okay, so full disclosure, we're not talking about the climbing part yet. First, I need to give some backstory. The Himalayan mountain range holds all the tallest mountains in the world. The tallest non-Himalayan mountain on Earth is Aconcagua, located in Argentina as part of the Andes. Its peak is 6,960 meters above sea level, which doesn't even put it in the top 100 for tallest mountains. Not only do the Himalayas have over 100 peaks that break 7,000 meters, 14 of those also make it over 8,000 meters. The incredible height of the Himalayas is the result of them being the youngest mountain range in the world, formed only 60 million years ago by a particularly violent collision between the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates. To contrast, the Appalachian Mountains are the last remains of the Grenville mountain range, which was formed almost 500 million years ago. In its prime, the Grenville Range is believed to have matched the modern Himalayas for height, if not even surpassed them. Today, the average height of the Appalachian Mountains is a meager 900 meters, with time having eroded the once towering peaks down to just gently rolling hills. Today, the 10 tallest mountains in the world are Annapurna, Nanga Parbat, Manaslu, Dhaulagiri, Cho-Oyu, Makalu, Lhotse, Kanchenjunga, K2, and Everest. What's weird about those last two names? In the early 1800s, the British began the Great Trigonometrical Survey of the Himalayas, trying to find, map, and name the tallest mountains in the world. In a rare display of basic human decency, they had a very strict policy of finding the most commonly accepted name the local inhabitants used for a mountain, and only putting that on a map. In fact, their entire survey of the Himalayan mountains, there was very few exceptions to this policy, and to my knowledge, none of them were really intentional. Two of those exceptions did wind up being the most famous, though: Mount Everest and K2, the two tallest mountains in the world. In the case of K2, they did genuinely search very hard for its proper name. It's just that K2 is also incredibly remote. The only village in the area couldn't even see the mountain without hiking over a glacier. For obvious reasons, no one bothered to do that. They're surrounded by giant mountains. Why the fuck would they want to take a cold, dangerous trek into a desolate area to look at a different big mountain? They really just didn't care. And despite this, the surveyors tried for a long time to find any possible name, until eventually they discovered the locals had adopted a common name for the mountain. They were calling it K2. K2 was just a placeholder before the proper name was found, as it was the second peak they marked on the Karakoram range. But the placeholder stuck and has long since become the mountain's true name. Meanwhile, with Everest, the story is less stupid, but also a lot stupider. See, when the surveyors first reached the border of Nepal, they weren't allowed across, despite multiple requests to just step in and take a look around their mountains. Unfortunately for them, the Nepalese government was capable of decent pattern recognition and had reached the conclusion that there was no way in hell they were letting any British people step foot inside their country. They're like cockroaches. Once you got one, the fuckers are never gonna go away, and they ruin any place they decide to move into, especially if it's a kitchen. So anyways, you can't get into Nepal, and that makes life harder. But they're still hard at work poking around the mountains to see what's up. By 1847, they were under the impression that Kanchenjunga was the tallest peak in the world, though she is number 3, so they were pretty damn close. When Surveyor General Andrew Wog noticed a peak beyond it that looked like it might be taller, though they'd need to take some more precise measurements to be able to tell. So he marked it as Peak 15, sent a group out there in 1848, and they were foiled by shit weather, stopping them from being able to even see the peak, let alone measure it. Then in 1849, James Nicholson was sent out to try again, and he managed to get the right measurements. He went back to crunch the numbers, then immediately got malaria and had to go home without doing the math. Lucky man. I know if I had a choice between malaria and trigonometry, I would choose malaria every time. Fuck math. So after this shit show, it's pretty clear that white people are just not having a great time with this one. So a Bengali surveyor by the name of Radhanath Sikdar stepped in to do the calculations for them, using Nicholson's data, and he concluded that yes, Peak 15 is definitely the highest peak in the world. 2 years of furious math then ensued, with a bunch of mountain-loving nerds sitting around trying to account for light refraction, barometric pressure, and all kinds of bullshit like that. Finally, Wog announced that the mysterious Peak 15 seemed to be 29,002 feet tall, which is 8,839 meters if we use the good measuring system. In reality, his final calculations actually said 29,000 feet exactly, but he slapped a 2 on the end to stop people from assuming he'd rounded the number up, which typically means that Andrew Wog is the first person to have put 2 feet on top of Everest. If you stop listening for that joke, I understand completely. Anyways, so after that, they start going into the process of trying to name this bad boy, and here's where they run into more problems. Still can't get into Nepal, right? And Tibet has taken a similar anti-British stance. Smart choice. But from India, Peak 15 is barely fucking visible and doesn't really stand out, so none of the locals they could talk to had actually bothered to name it. Or rather, the local villages had a few names for that one peak in the distance, but everyone used a different one because none of them really cared enough to work out a universal name. Now, just picking one and going with it wasn't fair, all the scattered names were equally common, but using a generic placeholder for the tallest mountain in the world seems a bit weak. Luckily, Andrew Wog has an idea. He'll do something nobody has ever tried before. He's going to take a massive natural landmark on a different continent, and he's going to name it after a generic white guy. And the generic white guy of choice, his predecessor, the former Surveyor General, Sir George Everest, whose name was actually spelled like Everest, he just pronounced it as Everest. And yes, I did have to write the name phonetically in my script to make sure I remembered that. When Sir Everest learned that his successor wanted to give the honor of having the top of the world named after him, he absolutely fucking hated the idea more than anything in the world. Because, again, they had standards for the name, and Sir Everest took that pretty seriously. He wanted a proper local name to be used for the damn thing, and he thought it was deeply wrong to have his own name put on it. Especially since he was under the impression that it was almost impossible to pronounce or spell Everest in Hindi, which, the locals spoke. I don't know if he was right. I know nothing about the languages. So if they had to pick a colonizing name, Everest at least wanted them to pick one the people living there could use. So naturally, since George Everest was furiously campaigning to not have his name put on the mountain, they went ahead and did it anyways. As one does. Since then, now that white people are allowed inside of Nepal and Tibet, we've learned that the proper Tibetan name is Chomolungma, which translates to Goddess Mother of the World, while the Nepalan name is Sagarmatha, meaning Goddess of the Sky. Personally, I consider Chomolungma to be the proper name. The Sherpa people are originally part of the Tibetan group in general. They're the ones native to the area, and the mountain is a holy site to them. The Sherpa are an ethnic minority in Nepal, and the Nepalan government doesn't really treat them with a lot of respect, so I'm inclined to trust the Sherpa's name for the mountain. Furthermore, the name Chomolungma has since been confirmed to have been in use as early as the 1700s, whereas Sagarmatha is the result of the Nepalan government realizing he didn't have a name for the mountain and coming up with one in 1960. Yeah. So, the mountain's real name is Chomolungma, and we really need to start calling her that. I think George Everest has been furiously spinning in his grave for long enough. The only reason Mount Everest has persisted as the name is because it's been widely publicized as being the name. Now we know better, so we can use the name it should have been given in the first place. To be clear, for the rest of the episode, I will be using Chomolungma to refer to Mount Everest, unless I am specifically quoting someone else or using a name for a committee or something. Okay, preamble done. Time to get on the mountain. Wait, what do you mean nobody wants to get on the mountain? I mean, yeah, anyone who isn't Nepalian or Tibetan can't even get near it yet, and even without that problem, it's kind of a death trap with 1800s equipment, so yeah, I guess that's fair. Nobody's even going near that mountain, let alone on it. At least not without a really good motive. Part 2. Dicks out for Chomolungma. For the record, if this show ever takes off enough for merch to become a thing, I will absolutely have stickers that say Dicks out for Chomolungma. So, back when they first got Chomolungma on the maps, the British weren't even considering trying to climb it because fuck that very much. They generally figured it wasn't even possible and called it a day. But as the 1800s were coming to an end, we started getting to the era of people being fascinated with the North and South Poles, which, of course, turned into the obligatory dick measuring contest of the major global powers wanting their explorers to get there first. The North Pole was reached in either 1908 or 1909. Two different teams claimed to have gotten there, but the '08 team didn't get any proof, and the '09 team got sloppy with the calculations near the end, so both are disputed. One of them probably did, though, and which one is irrelevant to the dong measuring contest because both teams were made up of American guys with Inuit guides. The British had seen quite a few Arctic expeditions end in tragedy, some of which we will be talking about in future episodes. So by the time polar attempts came up, they were more interested in the South Pole, which is the vastly superior pole. I'm sorry to my fellow Northerners, but come on, Antarctica has penguins. We cannot compete. So, the British were putting a lot of effort into exploring Antarctica, which led to them setting a lot of records there, including repeatedly breaking the furthest south record. Then in 1910, the British Terra Nova and the Norwegian Fram expeditions both headed for Antarctica, with respective captains Robert Scott and Roald Amundsen both intending to be the first men to reach the South Pole. In December of 1911, Amundsen and his team reached the South Pole, found no evidence of anyone else having been there recently or ever, so they left behind a little tent with some supplies and a letter that he asked Scott to deliver to the King of Norway. A little over a month later, in January of 1912, Scott and his team of 4 other men reached the South Pole, found Amundsen's tent, and turned back, understandably upset. Amundsen's team got back to safety with no real issues, but Scott never returned. Search parties from the Terra Nova expedition eventually found Scott and 2 of his companions frozen to death in their tent, with Scott's journal reporting that the 2 missing men had died on the return journey. Yes, this is all relevant. Shut the fuck up! Okay, it's mostly not relevant. All you need to know is that the Norwegian expedition got to the South Pole faster than the British expedition, and the British team ate shit and died on the way home. But trust me, I could not contain that. There was just so much going on there. The Scott and Munson clusterfuck is a story, and it's gonna be a damn good episode. Just generally, all the fuckery the British got up to in Antarctica is going to be a lot of damn good episodes. Love that whole saga to death. It's a future problem. Anyways, getting back to Chomolungma, it's the early 1900s, and the British are used to being the guys that do literally everything. Or at least they're the guys that get other people to do stuff for them, and then they steal the credit. But they weren't even in the running for being the first guys to the North Pole, and then they were thoroughly humiliated in the race to the South Pole, and that came right before World War I kicked off. Once that was over, the British Empire realized they were in danger of losing their position as the biggest guy inside the prison yard that is Earth. Ireland was trying to kick the English to the curb for good this time. Gandhi was leading the people of India in his movement to unanimously tell the British to fuck off, please. Various countries in Africa and the Middle East were getting sick of this shit and starting to push back against British rule. And while all that was going on, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand had made eye contact with each other, usually picked up their coats, and started slowly meandering towards the exit in the hopes that we could all just quietly leave before anyone noticed what we were doing. And if that wasn't enough, America was still riding the high of World War I and was starting to get ideas about being the new global superpower. So the British were looking for a new dick measuring contest to win, and fast. And hey, they'd gotten their asses kicked trying to get to the bottom of the world. Why not salvage it by going for the top? That's right, bitches, I've been talking for like 20 minutes, we're over 2,000 words deep into the script, and we've finally reached the main topic. People trying to climb the tallest mountain in the world with varying degrees of success. Look, I told you this was going to be unreasonably long, okay? Part 3. Can we please get on the mountain now? Okay, so it's 1921, and the very first expedition rolls up in the Himalayas. They're not really there to climb Chomolungma. I mean, if they can do it, they'll fucking do it, but their main goal is just to figure out how to get to the mountain in the first place, scout some possible routes for climbing, and just generally get a feel for what kind of planning and equipment they're going to need for a serious attempt. After all, the British had never even been to the mountain before. The closest anyone's ever gotten was just under 97 kilometers, which is about 60 miles, from it. The first step is to get on the damn mountain. The expedition was led by Charles Howard Bury with a four-man climbing team of Harold Rayburn, Alexander Kellis, Guy Bullock, and George Mallory. Rayburn and Kellis were both highly experienced mountaineers, while Bullock and Mallory were less practiced and had never been to the Himalayas before. The team also included surveyors Henry Morshead and Oliver Wheeler, who were also solid mountaineers because it's their job. Most of these names will not be coming up again after this expedition. We will see Henry Morshead again next year, but the name to remember is George Mallory. He is important. Spoiler alert, we're gonna talk about his corpse! Nepal was still firmly in the fuck off zone, so the 1921 recon expedition had to use the Tibet approach. Tibet was also still off limits, but luckily relations were good enough by that point that the expedition did get permission to enter the country, given to them by the Dalai Lama at the time. For the most part, the expedition went really well. I mean, they did get dysentery, but I think it just kind of happened in those days. Also, Kellis dropped dead of a heart attack before they could really get anywhere, but again, I think people dropping dead just kind of happened in those days. Oh, and Rayburn got sick enough that he needed to be evacuated, though he would later try to return to the team against medical advice, and his health never really recovered. He died a few years later. Anyways, a much more minor issue was that Mallory quickly grew to completely fucking hate Howard Bury, describing him as, and I quote, too much the landlord with not only Tory prejudices, but a highly developed sense of hate and contempt for other sorts of people than his own. It's okay, Mallory, I hate Tories too. So, by the time they actually got to the goddamn mountain that they were looking for, the expedition was left with the two junior climbers to take on fucking Chomolungma. No problem. Actually, it really wasn't much of a problem. Mallory was an excellent climber, and although he could be a little bit forgetful, meanwhile Bullock was not quite as strong, but he was as a climber, but he was very well organized and he could get along with anybody. Mallory and Bullock were, by all accounts, a great team, and they had a delightful time just climbing around, exploring the lower slopes of Chomolungma, taking pictures of everything, realizing Mallory had put all the photographic plates in backwards, so they hadn't actually taken any pictures of anything. Then they spent 2 days frantically scrambling around and retaking literally all of their pictures, but for real this time. So Mallory, Bullock, and Wheeler wound up successfully finding a feasible-looking route to reach the North Col, to which would eventually be the site of Camp 4 for their summit attempts until the 30s. In the modern day, the North Col is Camp 1 on the Tibetan route. With that done, they then retreated to base camp to wait for the monsoon season to pass. See, the thing about Chomolungma is it only has two real, serious climbing seasons. You can't do it in the summer because monsoon season means murder conditions. And you can't do it in the winter because the jet stream means murder conditions. I mean, it's possible people have done it, but it's a terrible idea and you shouldn't do it. If you want a weather window, you show up in the spring or the fall. Most people know about the spring season, which is April to May, and the majority of people summit at some point in the month of May. There's a smaller window of about a month between September and October, which is when a lot of professionals tend to climb these days because it's not covered with fucking tourists. The 1921 recon expedition did not reach the mountain until late June, and they did most of their exploring in July, and they found their route to the North Col in mid-August. On September 20th, the weather broke, so Mallory, Bullock, Morshead, and Wheeler made their first bid for the summit, and quickly realized there was absolutely no way in hell they could do that in one shot, so they retreated back to Camp 2 for more supplies, and went back up to Camp 3. Mallory, Bullock, Wheeler, and 3 Sherpas wound up trying for the North Col via the eastern Rongbuk Glacier, and they successfully got up there. But conditions on the North Col were really bad, with low temperatures and high winds, so they retreated back to the glacier. Realizing they would freeze to death if they tried to camp on the North Col in those conditions, the group decided that they were done. The higher camps were struck on September 26th, the expedition headed home, and they successfully returned to Darjeeling on October 25th without incident. A great summer vacation was had by all, except for the guy that dropped dead of a heart attack. He didn't enjoy it so much. I'm sure everyone else had a blast, though. Part 4. Discovery of the proper summit method. Huffing oxygen and carrying a complete amateur. 1922 came around, and some new kids signed up for the fun summer climbing camp with 2 returning parties. We've got Henry Moorehead back for his final round, and our boy George Mallory. This time the expedition was not about reconnaissance. Now it's time for some serious summit attempts. Square up, Chomolungma. The boys are coming to fight a fucking mountain. I started this by mentioning the first summit attempt wasn't until 1953, right? So yeah, the mountains are going to be winning this particular fight for a while. Now, the previous expedition, they did bring bottled oxygen. Unfortunately, it all belonged to Kellis, who dropped dead along the way, and also the others thought his idea of using bottled oxygen to survive high altitudes was dumb and also cheating, so they never even tried it. Luckily, the 1922 expedition did look into the research that had been done on high-altitude survival, and they decided, fuck it, we'll bring oxygen. This was a very smart idea because it's really fucking hard to survive up there, even with oxygen, so that was their best shot. But at the same time, it was also not a very smart idea because bottled oxygen was a very new technology and not great. The setup was that each mountaineer would carry 4 bottles at a time fixed to a carrying frame. The whole rig weighed 14.5 kilograms, or about 32 pounds, and each climber had 8 hours of oxygen. Because when I'm climbing a giant mountain, dude, under a time crunch with a 30-pound weight on my back. Oh, and again, new technology, so they were all very faulty and would need constant troubleshooting. For context, bottled oxygen setups in the modern day are much better. Most bottles, setups and everything weigh about 7 pounds each, and the bottle can hold 6 hours of air. Yeah, so for some weird reason, the mountaineers of the 1922 expedition really fucking hated their oxygen gear, and I don't blame them, it sucked. Going up there without oxygen would also suck, though, so they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. The expedition was led by Charles Bruce, with Edward Strutt as deputy leader, and they had mountaineers George Mallory, George Finch, Henry Moorehead, Howard Somervell, Arthur Wakefield, and Edward Norton. No, not the actor. They also had Dr. Thomas Longstaff as the expedition doctor, John Noel to take pictures and film, and then finally John Morris, Colin Crawford, and Geoffrey Bruce, Charles Bruce's cousin, to act as translators and general organizers. They also brought about 150 porters, some Indian, mostly Nepalan and Tibetan Sherpas. They had a route planned thanks to the recon for the year before. Their game plan was to go up the Rongbuk Glacier to the North Col, and from there the North Ridge and Northeast Ridge would give them a route to the summit. Unfortunately, nobody had ever been above the North Col, so they still didn't know about the obstacles in their way past that point. If you climb the Tibetan route, you need to contend with the 3 steps, specifically the absolutely brutal second step, a climb so difficult it wasn't confirmed to be done without help until 1985, 25 years after the first successful summit from the North Route in 1960. That team used the human ladder method to get over the second step, and in 1970, the Chinese government had a ladder brought up there and permanently affixed to the rock. The ladder was then replaced in 2007 over concerns about its age. Though the second step might have been climbed as early as in 1924 as part of a possibly successful summit, but we'll get to that later. Anyways, so Nepal was still off limits and would remain so until 1950, so they were stuck on the Tibetan route. So, on the 5th of May, the squad rolls up to Chomolungma and gets to work. Camps 1, 2, and 3 go up pretty quickly, with Camp 3, aka their advanced base camp, going near the top of the Rongbuk Glacier. On May 10th, Mallory and Somervell left base camp to establish Camp 4, and the next day they got the job done, placing Camp 4 on the North Col at 7,000 meters of elevation. Also, during the process of managing and organizing all this, Longstaff became sick with exhaustion and couldn't climb for the rest of the trip. Because you want your team doctor to be down for the count before you even really get started. So, the original game plan had been for Mallory and Somervell to take a trial climb without oxygen, then Finch and Norton try it with oxygen. But of course, most of the mountaineering team was sick by this point because fucking that's how life goes. So they scrapped that idea and decided, you know what, we'll just go with the people that can still climb. Mallory, Moorehead, Somervell, and Norton were the only ones still mostly healthy, and so they decided the 4 of them would make a summit bid together. On May 19th, the 4 of them left Camp 3 with a group of porters in nice sunny weather. They reached the North Col by early afternoon and sailed into Camp 4. They planned to proceed with light equipment from there. They had the 2 small tents, 2 double sleeping bags, a day and a half of food, a gas stove, and 2 thermos bottles. The next morning, Mallory woke up at like 5:30 like some kind of psychopath and convinced everyone else to get up and get going. The porters probably wanted them dead, though, because their tent turned out to be kind of shit, so they'd all slept really poorly. Most of them most of them headed back down the mountain, with only 5 porters choosing to carry on with it. So at 7 a.m. on May 20th, the 9 men ascended into land that no human had ever stepped foot on before. The weather turned on them pretty quickly, with temperatures plummeting. The porters' warm clothing turned out to not be good enough for the serious cold, which made them absolutely fucking miserable. And the rest of the men found that cutting steps into the ice was way harder than they expected, and that slowed their progress a lot. Eventually, the porters had to be sent back down the mountain for their own safety, and the 4 European climbers made Camp 5 at 7,620 meters, which aka 25,000 feet, instead of their original plan of making camp at 7,925 meters, aka 26,000 feet. The camp was pretty small, too. Somerville and Morsehead were able to put their tent up right on a flat, but Mallory and Norton had to spend the night camping out on a slope, which they found absolutely fucking uncomfortable as hell. So on May 21st, Mallory was apparently feeling a little bit reasonable, and the group got up at a slightly santer hour of 6:30 a.m., departing at 8. An entire backpack of food was dropped down the mountain for a bit, but Morsehead was able to go back and retrieve it, though that exhausted him enough that he stayed at Camp 5 instead of trying to ascend with the others. Mallory, Somerville, and Norton went up North Ridge in light snowfall, getting to about 150 meters below the upper northeast ridge, and then called it quits at 8,225 meters, a new world record for climbing altitude. It's not surprising that the group was feeling it by then, honestly. They'd gotten into the death zone, where the atmosphere cannot possibly sustain human life. There's a reason that climbers need to use oxygen in high mountains. Beyond 8,000 meters of elevation, you're slowly suffocating to death in thin air, and honestly, you're still in danger well below that. 5,000 meters is about where things start getting really dicey. That's the altitude of the highest permanent settlement in the world. It's just a tiny village in Peru. Above 6,000 meters, things get really deadly, but 8,000 is considered the line into the death zone. Even with oxygen, going up that high is incredibly dangerous. Without bottled oxygen and using the old gear of the 1920s, it's genuinely amazing that the 3 men made it as far as they did. At one point during their descent, Norton and Somerville both lost their footing and began to fall. This absolutely could have killed the entire trio, as they were all roped together. If their combined weight pulled Mallory down with them, then all of them would have fallen to their deaths. Luckily, though, Mallory was able to arrest their fall, anchoring the group with his ice axe long enough for the others to get their feet again. So they were united with Morsehead at Camp 5 without further incident. On May 22nd, the 4 began climbing down from the North Col, and that ended the first series attempt at Chum along the summit. Meanwhile, Finch had mostly got himself and decided that with the state the rest of the mountaineers were in, fuck it, he was better off climbing with healthy amateurs. So he recruited Jeffrey Bruce and Tejbir, a Gurkha Indian man from the Porters, and on May 25th, the trio departed from the North Col for the second summit attempt. Now, there's no records on Tejbir's climbing experience, or at least none that I could find, but it is a confirmed fact that Jeffrey Bruce had literally never even climbed a mountain before, meaning this attempt unknowingly began the long, epic tradition of an expert carrying a complete amateur up the goddamn mountain. Weather conditions were rough as the group faced extreme winds all the way up. Climb quickly proved the utility of bottled oxygen, though, as even the primitive rigs were an amazing help. The trio using oxygen had heavier loads, but they could still climb faster than the porters. Because, as it turns out, having a steady supply of oxygen is really useful when the atmosphere is thin enough for everyone to be slowly suffocating to death. Who knew? The trio made camp at 7,460 meters and prepared to keep going the next day. Unfortunately, May 26th came with terrible weather, leaving the 3 of them stuck in place. The storm broke on the 27th, and they were able to proceed through clear skies, but the wind got steadily worse over the day. Like the other porters, Tejbir's clothing wasn't good enough for the cold, and he began to falter, eventually being forced to turn back at 7,925 meters. Finch and Bruce carried on, but eventually they stalled on vertical progression and started searching for a route to continue up along the north face. Before they could find anything good, Bruce's oxygen gear started to have problems, and Finch decided that Bruce was unable to continue, and they ended their attempt. At 8,326 meters, they began their descent, making it back to Camp 3 by 5:30 p.m. Now, at this point, Dr. Longstaff advised that they end the expedition. Climbing the tallest mountain on Earth with tired, sick men is a disaster waiting to happen. But Somerville and Mallory argued for making another attempt, feeling it was safe to do so. And so on June 3rd, the third and final summit attempt set off, this time with Mallory, Somerville, Finch, Crawford, and 14 porters. The climbers were assisted with bottled oxygen, as Mallory had been really impressed with the progress Finch achieved with it, and he wanted to try that shit for himself. Finch, apparently still exhausted from his earlier attempt, only got to Camp 1 before he quit. The rest of the group reached Camp 3 on June 5th and rested for a day before returning to their ascent. On June 7th, Mallory, Somerville, and Crawford were leading the porters up waist-deep snow on the slope towards the North Col when disaster struck. A piece of snow came loose. It triggered an avalanche on the slope they were standing on. Mallory, Somerville, and Crawford were at the head of the group, and so for them, the avalanche didn't have much momentum when it reached them. They were partially buried, but the three of them were quickly able to dig themselves out. Everyone behind them was not so lucky. They were struck with a 30-meter wave of heavy snow, and 9 of them were swept away into a crevasse. 2 of the men were successfully rescued alive, but by the time the other 6 were found, they were already dead, and the 7th was never recovered at all. So he would have either been killed in the initial avalanche or he died buried in the snow there. Dorje, Lakpa, Norbu, Pasang, Pema, Sangay, and Tamba were killed in the avalanche, and the 7 of them are the first people to have died on the slopes of Chomolungma. The disaster was caused entirely by human error. The climbing team had made a fatal mistake in that they were attempting to travel directly up the slope of the glacier in a straight line. This caused them to compact the top of the snow, making it increasingly unstable until the single piece came loose and destabilized the entire area. I think snow physics is not one of my interests. That's just my best understanding of how an avalanche like that works. All I really know is the straight line was the problem. Since then, that route has been traveled with a meandering, curved path up the slope to avoid repeating the incident. Somerville was particularly shaken by the disaster. He was a doctor, and he'd served in World War I as a member of the Royal Army Medical Corps. During the Battle of Somme, he'd found himself working as one of only 4 surgeons in a tent, with hundreds of critically wounded patients overflowing the tent and covering the ground outside of it. When Somerville was forced to take breaks between rounds of surgery, he would sit and talk with the dying men, and he noticed that despite the situation they were in, none of them asked to be treated before the other wounded. This was an extremely life-changing, formative experience for Somerville, and he was a dedicated pacifist from that moment on, and he held that for the rest of his life. In the aftermath of the avalanche, he immediately realized that him and Mallory's poor judgment had been to blame for the whole thing. He was horrified by the deaths of the men, especially since they had paid the price for their carelessness. The avalanche was the end of the 3rd attempt and the end of the expedition as a whole. They were able to retreat back down to base camp without further disasters and safely return to Darjeeling by August 2nd. In the aftermath of the expedition, Mallory and Finch went on tour giving presentations about it and the mountain. This was partially to share information with a hopefully interested audience, like I'm doing right now, and that their second goal was to raise money, as a financial return on that trip would guarantee funding for the 3rd trip. They had meant to do another trip in 1923, but there was problems with organization and financing, so that was impossible, and they had to push it back to 1924. During the break time, Mallory also spent 3 months on tour in America. At one point during that trip, he was asked why the hell he wanted to climb Chomolungma anyways, at which point he gave his infamous answer, because it's there. Meanwhile, Somerville did not return to Britain with the rest of the team, at least not right away. He instead set out to see India. He made his way around the country, going from the far north all the way to the southernmost tip. This wound up being a life-changing journey for him, too. His sightseeing quickly turned into a work trip. He was really just shocked at the poverty in the area, especially with the lack of medical care. At one point, he found a hospital with a massive queue of patients waiting for treatment and only a single doctor to treat them all. And so Somerville immediately stepped in to join the poor bastard. Upon returning to Britain, Somerville abandoned his entire promising medical career he'd been building, and instead announced that as soon as the next Chomolungma expedition was over, he would be staying in India permanently to work as a doctor in an area that desperately needed them. That's not super relevant to the rest of the everything, to be honest. I just wanted to talk about that. Howard Somerville was a really cool dude. Spoilers for 1924, Somerville lives and makes good on his promise to stay in India for real this time. He didn't return to Britain until he retired sometime in the 60s. He had a whole teaching hospital that he helped fund. He was a solid guy. Anyways, the last real result of all this was that in the 1924 Paris Olympics, 21 members of the 1922 expedition were awarded gold medals in alpinism, with 12 for the British members, 1 for the Australian Finch, and 8 medals being given to the members of the Porter team, 7 Indians, and 1 Nepalan. This was technically the Summer Olympics, but at that point they were all Summer Olympics. That year they just did an experimental round of Winter Athletics as a sort of Olympics pregame in January, that would eventually evolve into the modern format of alternating the summer and winter. The point is, it meant the gold medals were distributed to the team before any of them left on the next expedition. Which turned out to be for the best because by the time the proper games rolled around in July, one of them would be permanently unavailable. Part 5. Shit gets real. Okay, so it's 1924, we worked out the money issues, we got things organized, time to try for the summit of Chomolungma again. And you know what they say, third time's the charm, they've definitely got it this time. They definitely don't got it, except maybe they did. Let's fucking go, this is where things get good. Now, they'd learned some things from the 1922 expedition. For a start, they'd realized, hey, the porters aren't just there to do the bitch work, they're like actually really good mountaineers too? Wild. This is where the balance begins shifting. Right now, we're still at Europeans lead, Sherpas follow, but it's evening out to the equal partnership that occurred between Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, and then tips over into the modern day Sherpas lead, Westerners follow. And they'd learned that bottled oxygen is the fucking bomb, so they were definitely bringing that. Minimal bitching this time. Though the debate is raging about if bottled oxygen was cheating or not, an argument that is ongoing to this day. Personally, I say no, and I don't really like the glorification of climbing without it. Bottled oxygen is an adaptive device to help you function in an environment the human body cannot survive in. Yeah, it makes the climb easier. You know what else makes it easier to climb an 8,000-meter peak? Crampons and a snowsuit. If you want to climb without artificial assistance, get naked, start free climbing, and see how that works out. Like, yeah, you can climb without oxygen if you want, but I don't think we should celebrate people for choosing to forego safety equipment on a dangerous climb just to prove a point. Anyways, so on the roster this year was a few returning faces. Charles Bruce was running the show again, and his cousin Jeffrey was back too. It's an actual mountaineer. Because apparently climbing Chomolungma gave him a taste for it, and he was hooked on mountaineering in general. It's addictive, I understand completely. It also saw the return of Howard Somerville, Edward Norton, and George Mallory. Charles Bruce's leadership didn't last long, though, as he contracted malaria shortly after their arrival in Tibet, leaving Edward Norton to take the wheel. Funnily enough, one that didn't return was our friend George Finch, the guy that carried Jeffrey Bruce up the damn mountain in the first place. The expedition felt they had a very good chance at making the summit this time, so Finch had been pointedly uninvited on the grounds that he was Australian. And as we all know, Australian people are icky and cannot be allowed on the summit before the proper British people. And besides, he was divorced, and he had let people pay him to give lectures before. Ugh. Aren't the 1920s fun? For what it's worth, this was not a popular decision among the mountaineers. Jeffrey Bruce always spoke very highly of Finch and rightfully gave him the credit for their success in 1922, describing it as one of the best experiences of his life. Mallory was especially displeased about his fellow George being excluded and tried to resign in protest, but the secretary of the Everest Committee called up the British royal family and asked them to talk him into staying, and that persuaded him to remain with the expedition. This would turn out to be an unfortunate choice, though. Fair warning, I hope you all haven't gotten too attached to our good friend Mallory, because I was not joking about the corpse thing earlier, and we're getting to that time. There was also some new faces joining the party, namely Noel Odell, Bentley Beatham, and John DeVars Hazard, a trio of gentlemen whose names are actually real. And finally, they recruited our other major player for this trip, Andrew Irvine, an engineering student brought along to try out some young blood on Chomolungma. And fun fact, Chomolungma will certainly be taking his blood. No, we're not going to talk about Irvine's corpse. Not for a lack of interest. I would love to talk about it. The problem is we still haven't found the damn thing. I remain hopeful that he shows up one day, though, because let me tell you, a lot of people will do some dark shit just to get at one specific item Irvine would have had when he died, myself included. But we'll circle back to that later. Right now, we're putting together the expedition, and Irvine is still alive and delightful. While I still maintain it was incredibly stupid not to bring Finch, given that he was one of the major pioneers in the science of bottled oxygen, that stupid was at least mitigated by bringing Irvine. His powers of engineering turned out to be incredibly useful and allowed him to help improve the oxygen gear while also making the rigs a little bit lighter. He also did most of the repairs that the equipment needed, so solid guy. Also back for another round was John Noel, the camera guy from the 1922 team, who was apparently an okay mountaineer. He had joined Finch's team for part of their climb and was waiting at the North Col for their return. When Finch and Bruce were When Finch and Bruce were descending from the North Col, they were doing it in the dark with bad weather, and Noel had gotten worried about them. When they made it back to Camp 4, they discovered that Noel had been burning his own unused film to use as a makeshift flare to help guide possibly distressed climbers back to safety. So it seems like the kind of guy you want to have on a mountain with you. But also, they really should not have brought him because he was not at all the guy to have on that specific mountain. Or just generally inside Tibet at all. Yeah, you know that joke I made about how British people ruin any country they get inside of? John Noel took that as a fucking challenge. We will set that aside for now, but trust me, it's going to come back up because the next expedition wasn't until 1933, and there is a reason for that gap. But for now, we've got the boys together, let's go climb a fucking mountain. Now, Nepal is still closed for business, and they will remain so for another 26 years, so once again, we're on the Tibetan route. And they still don't know about the motherfucker that is the second step. That particular obstacle is at 8,600 meters, so the closest they've gotten to that was Finch and Bruce hitting 8,326 meters, and they were fucking around on the north face, and the steps are on the ridge. With the experience from the 1922 expedition, and the benefit of having had another year to sit around thinking about it, they went in with a strong game plan. On April 29th, the expedition arrived at the site of their base camp in the Rongbuk Valley and got to work. With the help of about 150 porters, camps went up quickly and camps were quickly established and expanded. Camp 1 was at the foot of the glacier at 5,400 meters. Camp 2 was on the glacier at 6,000 meters and was about halfway to Camp 3, aka Advanced Base Camp, at 6,400 meters. By the first week of May, the first three camps were ready to go, and then a snowstorm rolled in and ground all progress to a halt, so they waited for conditions to improve. The weather broke in mid-May, allowing the men to head back up to Camp 3, and they spent May 20th fixing ropes on the North Col. Camp 4 was erected on May 21st at 7,000 meters. Then the weather immediately went to shit again because Chomhalungma really does love saying "fuck you" specifically. The second storm could have spelled disaster for the expedition right away. John DeVars Hazard had been at Camp 4 with about a dozen porters, and the 13 men had remained there to try and ride out the storm despite low food supplies. One might even go so far as to say that the conditions were a hazard? If you stop listening for that joke, I understand completely. Hazard was able to descend successfully along with 8 of the porters, but they were forced to leave 4 of the men behind, as those men had decided the descent was too dangerous to try, and they refused to leave. When the rest of the team learned about the 4 men in distress, Somerville led Norton and Mallory in an incredibly dangerous rescue mission, with the 3 of them climbing back up to the North Col in the storm to retrieve the trapped men. Incredibly, the rescue was a success. The whole party made it back to Camp 1 without any loss of life. At that point, their prep work was done, and it was time to arrange teams for their summit bids. As I mentioned at the start of this section, this year is when the British began recognizing that the Sherpa men they hired were expert climbers in their own right. They'd been paying close attention to the porters while setting the camps, and this was the payoff. 60 porters stayed with the party after the camps were established, and 15 of those men were singled out as the strongest climbers in the group. Those 15 were declared the Tigers of the porters, and they played a vital role in the future summit bids. The team planned for Mallory and Bruce to make the first attempt on the summit, followed by Norton and Somerville beginning the second attempt the next day. Odell and Irvine were stationed at Camp 4 to support the summit teams, with Hazard on standby at Camp 3. The 3 men were also there to act as a reserve team for the third attempt, and that third attempt was the really eventful one. On June 1st, Mallory and Bruce left Camp 4 with 9 Tiger porters supporting them. This attempt would turn out to be relatively uneventful. Camp 4 was in a pretty sheltered section of the North Col, and upon leaving its protection, the team quickly discovered that a brutally cold wind had came up over the north face. The inhospitable conditions caused 4 of the porters to bail, literally dropping their loads and leaving the group on the spot, partially up the slope. The rest of the men reached the site of Camp 5 at 7,681 meters, and then Bruce and one of the remaining porters went back to retrieve the abandoned equipment, while Mallory and the other 4 men established Camp 5. They had meant to keep ascending the next day to establish Camp 6, but the next morning 3 of the 5 remaining porters refused to keep going, and so Mallory and Bruce conceded the point. On June 2nd, the first summit then ended, and they began climbing back down. On that same day, Norton and Somerville had set out for their attempt along with the other 6 Tigers. They were surprised to run into Mallory and Bruce already throwing in the towel, but chose to press on in the hopes that their team would brave the conditions a little better. When they reached Camp 5, 2 of their porters were forced to withdraw back to Camp 4, but the remaining 4 men were soldiering on. The 6 of them spent the night at Camp 5 and then continued to ascend. On June 3rd, Camp 6 was established at 8,170 meters. Meanwhile, Mallory had just remembered that bottled oxygen absolutely fucks, which Bruce would have helped him confirm. Their aborted summit attempt had made Jeffrey Bruce the first person to attempt to summit Chomolungma both with and without the assistance of bottled oxygen, giving him a first-hand understanding of the added difficulty of trying to climb a mountain while suffocating to death. So while all that was going on higher up, Mallory and Bruce were in the process of returning to Camp 3, retrieving the oxygen gear, and hauling it back up to Camp 4. With the final camp established, the porters were also heading back to Camp 4, leaving Norton and Somerville alone near the top of the world. On the morning of June 4th, they were ready to make their final push to the summit, and then immediately knocked over one of their water bottles, forcing them to get the stove going again to melt some snow and refill the damn thing. So at 6:40 a.m., they began their ascent, but for real this time. On that note, it is worth mentioning that having to completely refill one person's water supply would take a hell of a lot longer up there in the modern day, because now we have a much better understanding of how not to die in a fucking mountain. Norton and Somerville were making a push for the summit with exactly 1 liter of water each. For context, in this day and age, just trying to hike up to the base camp with only 1 liter of water per person would be considered suicidal. 3 to 4 liters of water a day is the recommended amount. And that's on the hike. You should be taking on the actual climb up to 5 liters. So trying to do it with only 1 liter of water each is a choice. But in their defense, massively underestimating water requirements is kind of the running theme for pre-World War II mountaineering as a whole, so what can you do? Anyways, Norton and Somerville were making a summit push with no oxygen, basically no water, and they were climbing up into relatively unknown territory. It's a great combination. Luckily for them, they were also doing it in perfect weather, so off they went. After climbing 200 meters up the North Ridge, they decided to do a diagonal traverse across the north face, looking for a good route to the summit pyramid. Not an easy task without oxygen. It was slow and difficult work. By noon, Somerville was unable to continue climbing. Norton was still going strong at this point, though, so the pair split up, with Somerville waiting and resting while Norton carried on. At one point, Somerville took a picture of Norton struggling up the slope, close to his highest elevation point of 8,573 meters. That picture would remain the confirmed world record for highest altitude until 1952, just a year before the summit was reached. Finally, Norton was forced to turn back as well, as his own strength was starting to flag, and the day was getting too late for a summit bid to be feasible anyways. At 2 p.m., Norton rejoined Somerville, the two began their descent, and Somerville immediately dropped his ice axe off a cliff. Oops. That was the least of Somerville's worries during the descent, though. The mountain air was so cold that Somerville had begun developing frostbite on the inside of his throat, specifically with his mucous membrane. The problem had been developing over the course of the trip, and Somerville had been struggling with a sore throat, a cough, and some occasional problems breathing. But now it hit the critical point. As the pair were descending, the damaged membrane came loose, and Somerville immediately began to choke. An airflow obstruction is alarming at the best times, and the death zone is not the best place to have that. To make it worse, Norton was in the lead, and he didn't notice Somerville's distress behind him, especially since Somerville couldn't even breathe enough to call for help. Choking, unable to continue, watching his only companion accidentally abandoning him, Somerville sank into the snow and waited to die. As a final desperate attempt to live, he pressed his hands into his chest and pushed, forming a variant of what would eventually be known as the Heimlich maneuver on himself. And that did it. The obstruction suddenly came loose, allowing Somerville to cough up the remains of his throat's mucous membrane. Obvious reasons, this was kind of gross and incredibly painful, but he was well past the point of giving a fuck about little things like that. He was too busy being amazed that not only could he breathe again, he could breathe better than he had in days. He spat out the rest of the blood and bits of flesh, and started hauling ass after Norton, who now had half an hour lead on him and still no idea that his buddy had been actively dying behind him the whole time. So I'm sure that was a fun conversation. At 9:30 p.m., Norton and Somerville returned to Camp 4 where Mallory was waiting. He offered them some oxygen, but they were more interested in getting water, which is not very surprising, honestly. They would have been damn dehydrated after all that. Later that night, Mallory informed Norton of the plan he had for the final attempt. Assisted with oxygen, Mallory would make a final bid for the summit, alongside the youngest climber of the group, Andrew Irvine. This was for a few reasons. For a start, Mallory and Irvine had bonded on the trip to reach the mountain, with the two becoming very fast friends. If you're going into the death zone, you want to do it with someone you like and trust. More importantly, while Irvine was not the strongest climber on the team, and he had no experience with high-altitude climbing, he had an advantage no one else could match. Andrew Irvine was an engineer. and a damn good engineer, too, by all accounts. He had a natural gift for it and a reputation for being able to improvise ways to fix or even improve any mechanical device he got his hands on. At one point during World War I, he caused a bit of a stir in the government war office by sending them design schematics for a gyroscopic stabilizer for their planes and an early prototype for synchronization gear, a device to allow planes to fire a machine gun through the spinning blades of a nose propeller. Apart from that contribution, Irvine never served in the First World War. It ended when he was only 16. He had just celebrated his 22nd birthday a few days after the expedition reached Tibet. Mallory was certain that bottled oxygen was their best chance for making the summit, but the equipment was faulty and prone to failing. If he wanted to have oxygen, he needed to have Irvine. But before we can get to that, there's something else that came up. Here's a fun fact. Fresh snow can reflect about 8% of the UV radiation that shines on it, which can cause sunburns. On your corneas! This is known in the business as snow blindness. Not a pleasant issue to have, especially given that the situations most likely to cause it are also the situations where you kind of need to use those eyes. Like, and I'm just giving an example here, being at 7,000 meters of elevation on the side of fucking Chomolungma. Yeah, so shortly after returning to Camp 4, Norton began experiencing a burning pain in his eyes as snow blindness set in. Luckily, this is a temporary problem. Once the burn heals, your vision's okay, there's no permanent damage, or even a chance of it, but it's very uncomfortable and, more importantly, can leave you suddenly blind at very inconvenient moments. Norton was just lucky he'd made it there before his symptoms showed up. He must have burned his eyes somewhere on the summit push. If he'd started losing his sight while descending in the dark, I'd probably be telling you a very different story right now. Anyways, but by the morning of June 5th, Norton was completely blind, and he would stay that way for the next 60 hours. But there was a final summit bid to prepare for. During the day, Mallory laid out his summit plans to Norton, as their conversation the night before had been kept brief by Norton's exhaustion and also his eyeballs suddenly being on fire. As the expedition leader, Norton had the authority to order them not to climb, so they needed his approval. He wasn't sure of Irvine being on the team, given his limited experience, but he trusted Mallory's judgment on the matter. After all, Mallory was chief climber of the expedition, and at that point, he was the world's expert on Chomolungma. He'd spent more time on the mountain than any other living person. Norton approved their plans. Mallory and Irvine would leave the next day. Norton remained at Camp 4 on the 5th, helping coordinate the imminent summit push despite being mostly incapacitated. And on June 6th, the still blind Norton was evacuated down to Camp 3, a process that involved 6 Sherpas taking turns physically carrying him down the mountain. John Noel managed to film Norton being carried into Camp 3 and included it in the final cut of his movie, The Epic of Everest. And trust me, we will be talking about that fucking movie later. Mallory and Irvine also left on June 6th, leaving for Camp 5 at 8:40 a.m. alongside 8 porters. They had their oxygen gear with 2 cylinders each and a day of food. The 10 men reached Camp 5 without incident, and half the porters returned to Camp 4, bringing with them a message from Mallory saying, "There is no wind here, and things look hopeful." This was normal. In the days before radio, sending notes with descending porters was pretty much the only means the summit team had to communicate with the rest of the party. On June 7th, Mallory, Irvine, and the 4 remaining porters left Camp 6. Left for Camp 6, sorry. At the same time, Noel Odell was heading up to Camp 5 to assist the summit team along with a porter. Shortly after the pair reached Camp 5, they were joined by the 4 descending porters, having safely escorted Mallory and Irvine to Camp 6 before descending themselves. They also had 2 notes from Mallory, reading, "Dear Odell, we're awfully sorry to have left things in such a mess. Our Una cooker rolled down the slope at the last moment. Be sure of getting back to 4 tomorrow in time to evacuate before dark, as I hope to. In the tent, I must have left a compass. For the Lord's sake, rescue it. We are without. To here on 90 atmospheres for 2 days, so we'll probably go on 2 cylinders, but it's a bloody load for climbing. Weather for the job. Yours ever, G. Mallory." The second note was for John Noel, and it said, "Dear Noel, we'll probably start early tomorrow, 8, to have clear weather. It won't be too early to start looking out for us, either crossing the rock bend under the pyramid or going up Skyline at 8 p.m. Yours ever, G. Mallory." Noel was further down the mountain at Camp 3, but he did receive the message that night. Mallory's note was very useful to him. Now he knew where he could find the pair on the mountain, and when they would be there. If the weather stayed clear, he could capture part of their summit attempt from where he was filming at a lookout point near Camp 3. Noel and Mallory had discussed the possibility earlier, and they were hopeful the pair would be visible at those spots, even from the great distance. Mallory had also made a typo in the second note, writing PM instead of AM, but the mistake was obvious enough that Noel understood that he'd actually meant 8 AM. Unbeknownst to anyone else, though, those 2 notes would be Mallory and Irvine's final message. The poor The four porters that had been with Mallory and Irvine were tired, and the porter that ascended with Odell was showing signs of altitude sickness, so Odell sent the 5 men back down the mountain and spent the night at Camp 5 alone. On June 8th, Mallory and Irvine began their bid for the summit. Down at Camp 3, Noel and 2 porters set up at the lookout spot. Noel readied his camera, focusing it on the area Mallory had told him to watch. The 3 men also had a telescope, which they used to take turns watching for Mallory and Irvine. As soon as the pair were spotted through the telescope, Noel would turn the camera on. Unfortunately, the group never found the 2 climbers, and by 10 a.m., clouds had blocked their view of the summit ridge entirely. Meanwhile, Odell had enjoyed a peaceful night at Camp 5 and began ascending to Camp 6 at 8 a.m., where he would perform geological studies and assist the summit team if necessary. A mist had settled in, so he was unable to see further up the mountain to where the men would have been climbing. Shortly after noon, Odell's geology work resulted in him finding the first fossils on Chomolungma, a discovery he was understandably very excited about. Chomolungma's summit is mostly made up of limestone, which has been found to contain the fossils of various marine creatures from the Cambrian period about 500 million years ago, which is really fucking cool and must have been incredible to discover. Though, sadly, given what also happened that day, Odell probably looked back on the moment as bittersweet at best. At any rate, while he was celebrating his discovery, the mist suddenly cleared, allowing Odell to view the summit ridge for the first time that day. He described what he witnessed as such. At 12:50, just after I had emerged from a state of jubilation at finding the first definite fossils on Everest, there was a sudden clearing of the atmosphere, and the entire summit ridge and final peak of Everest were unveiled. My eyes became fixed on one tiny black spot silhouetted on a small snow crest beneath a rock step in the ridge. The black spot moved. Another black spot became apparent and moved up the snow to join the other on the crest. The first then approached the great rock step and shortly emerged at the top. The second did likewise. Then the whole fascinating vision vanished, enveloped in cloud once more. That was the last time Mallory and Irvine would ever be seen alive. Now, this sighting leaves many unknowns. For a start, it's entirely possible that Odell never even saw the pair at all, given the inability to recognize details from the distance and the short window of time he had to see them. He also could have just seen 2 birds, and there are some birds that live in high altitudes there. He could have mistaken them for the climbers. Furthermore, Mallory was not being assisted by, Mallory? Odell was not being assisted by bottled oxygen. Being in the death zone impairs judgment and can cause interesting discrepancies in short-term memory. One reason why disasters on 8,000-meter peaks are so damn confusing is because when there's a lot of people involved, they'll all often remember completely different events. In general, unless a group of people are in agreement about what happened, there's no way for even them to know how accurate their testimony is. The human brain doesn't like being suffocated to death. Odell was alone at Camp 6. While he spent the rest of his life certain he'd seen Mallory and Irvine, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Even if Odell did see them, their position is another unknown. Odell saw Mallory and Irvine either at the top of the first step or the second step, and which one is the vital question. If they were on top of the first step, then they were extremely late, and they would have had little to no chance of hitting the summit. But if they were on top of the second step, then all that was left was the third step, an easy 10-meter slope that leads straight to the summit snowfield. Once you're past that, it's smooth sailing to the top. The question of if Mallory or Irvine reached the summit has been the subject of extensive debate since 1924. Odell's testimony was inconclusive, as he changed his opinion several times. Over the years, he bounced between claiming they were at the base of the second step, on top of the first step, and at top of the second step. We'll never really know what Odell saw that day. Shortly before his death, he admitted that he'd never actually been certain where exactly he had seen them, as he'd spotted them at a bad angle to determine their position on the mountain. Regardless, that was the last glimpse they would get. At 2 p.m., a major storm began. Odell was certain Mallory and Irvine would be descending, and he began whistling and yelling, hoping to guide them back to camp. But the extreme cold forced him to retreat to the tent. He stayed in shelter until 4 p.m. when the storm passed. Odell emerged, scanned the mountain for Mallory and Irvine, but saw no signs of life. Now, despite the worrying absence of the men, Odell left Camp 6 at 4:30. This was a necessity. Camp 6 only contained a single tent that could only fit 2 people. Odell would have to descend to a lower camp now, while the weather was clear, or he would be trapped outside in the deadly storm if the 2 men returned. At 6:45 p.m., Odell returned to Camp 4. There was still no sign of Mallory and Irvine. The next morning, Odell and the 2 porters began to ascend to search for the missing men. They reached Camp 5 at 3:30 p.m. and spent the night. On June 10th, Odell returned to Camp 6 alone, and to his horror, he found that it hadn't even been touched since he left 2 days ago. At that point, all hope was lost. Mallory and Irvine had spent 3 days in the death zone, completely exposed. There was no chance of their survival. Still, Adele ascended to search for them, climbing up to 8,200 meters to look, but he found no sign of the missing men. Defeated, he returned to Camp 6 and laid Mallory and Irvine's blankets out on the snow to form a cross. This was a prearranged signal so that Camp 3 would learn the dire news as soon as they saw it through the telescope. The cross meant no trace can be found, given up hope. Adele returned to Camp 4 on June 11th, and the expedition left Chomolungma. George Mallory was 37 and left behind his wife Ruth and their 3 children, Frances, Claire, Barry, and John. His eldest, Claire, was 8 years old. Mallory had previously worked as a teacher, and the poet Robert Graves had been one of his students. In his autobiography, Graves spoke highly of how Mallory encouraged his love of literature and poetry and always treated his students with kindness. Claire Mallory would go on to have children of her own, the youngest of which she would name after her father. In 1995, that George Mallory successfully climbed Chomolungma, reaching the summit via the North Ridge. He left a photo of his grandparents at the top, explaining it as only unfinished business. Andrew Irvine never married and had no children. Despite that, he was well remembered as a brilliant engineer, a fearless adventurer, and a treasured friend. One of his friends, fellow mountaineer Arnold Lund, described him as, "Irvine did not live long, but he lived well." Into his short life, he crowded an overflowing measure of activity, which found its climax in his last wonderful year, a year during which he rode in the winning Oxford boat, explored Spitzbergen, fell in love with skiing, and, perhaps, conquered Everest. The English loved to live well rather than live long. In the years following their deaths, evidence of Mallory and Irvine's final hours was scarce. The next expedition in 1933 found an ice axe belonging to one of them, 230 meters east of the first step and 20 meters below the ridge, on an angled slab covered in loose pebbles. They reached the conclusion that this had been the scene of a fatal accident. Its presence on the slab suggested that it had been dropped there, either from one of the men losing his grip on the tool while falling, or being forced to suddenly drop it to grab a rope with both hands. This was disputed by Odell later, as he argued there was little to no use for an ice axe on the rest of the summit route, and so it was equally likely to have been left there intentionally to be retrieved on the descent. In 1963, the ice axe was confirmed to have belonged to Irvine, when an examination of his possessions noted some of them marked with a triple notch pattern, with an identical mark having been on the handle of the ice axe found in 33. Note that the ice axe must have belonged to either Mallory or Irvine, though. They were the first people to reach that point on the northeast ridge. Somerville did lose his own ice axe earlier, but it was dropped down the north face, quite a ways away from where Irvine's axe was found. So this axe would be the only artifact located until 1991, when American mountaineer Eric Simonson spotted some extremely old oxygen bottles while making his first climb to the summit in 91. But we'll come back to that in the next section. In the aftermath of a 1936 expedition, mountaineer Frank Smith wrote a letter to Edward Norton about spotting something below the ice axe site, saying, "I was scanning the face from base camp through a high-powered telescope when I saw something queer in a gully below the scree shelf. Of course, it was a long way away and very small, but I have a 6.6 eyesight, and I don't believe it was a rock." This object was at precisely the point where Mallory and Irvine would have fallen had they rolled on over the scree slopes. The letter also specifically mentioned instructed Norton not to speak of this or to warn anyone. The men were worried that if the press found out about the possible sighting of the body, it would turn into a media sensation. They were concerned for Mallory's widow and his children. Family deserved privacy. Smith's letter was Smith's letter was only found in 2013 when his son found it among his possessions after his death, and the letter describes the site where Mallory's body was eventually found. The strange rock he spotted was probably Mallory's back, as leather damage had begun the process of shredding his clothes. His clothing was all earthy colors, it blends in with the scree slope he was on, but his exposed skin turned white as it mummified. After 1936, there was no further sign of the men for many years. The final Tibetan-British expedition in 1938 found nothing. And then World War II kicked off, and the expeditions couldn't resume till 1950, at which point the Chinese annexation of Tibet meant the north face of the mountain was off limits. And even when Chinese climbers did see things, reports of new discoveries couldn't reach the west until years after the fact, if not decades. In 1975, Wang Hongbao claimed to have found the remains of a British man wearing damaged, old-fashioned clothing, laying on his side at the foot of a rock with a hole in his cheek. This didn't reach the west until 1979, when Wang was part of a joint expedition with Japanese mountaineers, where he told his story to Ryotun Hasegawa, leader of the Japanese contingent. No further information could be obtained, however, as Wang Hongbao was killed in an avalanche the next day. Despite the tragedy, Hasegawa shared the information Wang had given him. The story eventually reached historian Tom Holzell, who used the reports to launch a search expedition in 1989. On the last day of his expedition, he met with Zhang Junyan, Wang's teammate from 1975. Zhang confirmed the story, saying that Wang had returned from a 20-minute excursion and described finding a foreign mountaineer's remains at 8,100 meters. At that time, Mallory and Irvine were the only Europeans to have died at over 8,000 meters on the north face, so the body Wang found must have belonged to them, to one of them. The Chinese Mountaineering Association officially denies the claims of both men, though. In 2001, a historian on the Mallory and Irvine research expedition team spoke with the remaining members of the 1960 Chinese expedition, as they'd been the first people on the North Face since the British expeditions of the 30s. Zhu Jing, deputy leader of the 1960 expedition, was forced to abort his own summit attempt before reaching the second step, having become dangerously exhausted. He reported that while descending the first step, he spotted a corpse laying on its back, feet facing uphill inside a hollow in the rock. The sighting was brief, however, as Zhu had been descending alone and in extreme distress. All he could remember was having seen a body. He wasn't sure where exactly it was beyond the vaguest sense. In more recent years, a clearer account has surfaced. In 1969, Wang Fuqiu, a member of the 1960 team, gave a lecture about Chomolungma to the USSR Geographical Society in Leningrad. During that lecture, he mentioned having found a mummified corpse at 8,600 meters, near the base of the second step. If Mallory's body was spotted in 1936, which it almost certainly was, then the 1960 Chinese team must have found the body of Irvine. It was only briefly mentioned. The team wasn't even that interested in the find. They were having oxygen troubles, and they were a lot more focused on the imminent challenge of the second step. But the sighting still means a hell of a lot. Part 6. The gang finds a dead body. Okay, so remember like 20 hours ago I mentioned I'd discussed Mallory's corpse in an uncomfortable amount of detail? Well, guess what, people? It's corpse time. First of all, though, let me just deliver the warnings for this segment. Yes, I am going to describe the literal corpse of George Mallory in some detail. I have seen it, and the description should include a link to the footage of his corpse being found so that you can see it too if you want. None of this will be graphic, though. His wounds weren't major, and his body was mummified by the time he was found. Despite that, this is still, the corpse of a human being that we've been getting to know, and I understand completely if you are not down with that. Especially since I will also be laying out how I feel he and Irvine died, and that's going to be a damn depressing little story. If you scroll down, there should be a pinned comment marking the start of each section, and one of those should also be marked as being for skipping the corpse stuff. That should take you past all the dead body talk, and also past the section where I describe how I think they died. If you take the skip, you'll just bounce right ahead to the other half of this part, which is trying to figure out if Mallory and Irvine made it to the summit. So if you're going to nope out, now is when you do that. I promise we're going to lighten up after this. No spoilers, but part 8 is like entirely focused on some completely insane stuff. It's hilarious. You will love it. But anyways, right now it's corpse time. Everyone know what's getting out? Fantastic. Let's do this thing. In 1999, Eric Simonson organized an expedition to try and find the remains of Mallory or Irvine with a team of climbers from America, Britain, and Germany. With the location of Irvine's ice axe, Wang's report of the dead body, and the oxygen tank spotted by Simonson back in 91, they mapped out an area to search, as it was most likely to be the resting place of one or both men. On May 1st of 99, the team began their search for the pair that had gone missing 75 years ago. Almost immediately, team member Conrad Anker accidentally wandered off course, went in the wrong direction, and managed to stumble across one of the bodies, about 100 meters below where Irvine's ice axe was found, though in a different area of the slope down there, too far out of the way to have actually fallen from the ice axe site. Upon investigating, they found the clothing had the name tag of G. Mallory sewn on the inside, and they confirmed the identity with the other personal effects that was on him, namely a bill for climbing equipment that he had from London in his wallet, and some other stuff that was in there. His oxygen equipment was gone, and his snow goggles were in his pocket, unbroken. Mallory had several injuries, though. He'd suffered a serious rope jerk wound around his waist, indicating that he and Irvine were roped together when one of them experienced a major fall. The area he landed in is something of a minor graveyard, holding many climbers from more recent years that have fallen to their deaths from the Northeast Ridge. It's a pretty serious drop, and the other bodies found there were all pretty seriously damaged, with a lot of broken and shattered bones. But in contrast, Mallory's remains were almost entirely intact, which suggests he fell from a relatively short height and wasn't killed by the fall itself. His right leg was broken in two places, seriously enough that he would have been unable to walk, and his elbow was dislocated. He was killed by a golf ball sized hole in the forehead, and the wound would have been inflicted with enough force to punch through his skull. Judging by the size, it's possible the wound was caused by an ice axe. Now, if two guys were on Shoma Longma and one killed the other one with an ice axe, would they be fucked up or what? It wasn't murder. I'm not saying that. That was a joke. I'm sorry, the setup was too good. I had to. Anyways, seriously, there's no chance it was murder. Mallory's body was found face down, partially buried in the scree, and his arms were reaching up the hill. Now, while Mallory's location does match with Xu Jing's report of seeing a corpse that fell below the first step, his position is almost the exact opposite of how Xu Jing described it, and his death wound being a hole in the forehead does not match Wang Hongbao's story of a corpse with a hole in his cheek. Both of these contradictions can be explained, though. Again, like I've mentioned, the Death Zone does some fun and exciting things to the human brain and its capacity to remember things. Furthermore, the brain really doesn't like to be confused, so if something goes wrong with the data it's supposed to be processing and recording, it's pretty normal for the brain to just make something up to fill in the gap and pretend that that's what happened. During the 2008 K2 disaster, a lot of climbers were left stranded in the death zone by a series of avalanches, and 11 of them were killed in the process. Despite multiple survivors giving eyewitness accounts, it's still kind of unclear how exactly the whole thing unfolded, as some of the testimonies just outright contradict each other repeatedly, even when there's no motive to lie. One victim, Gerard McDonald, might have been killed in the second avalanche, as one of his surviving teammates claims to have found his body in the rubble afterwards. But his other surviving teammate swears that he saw McDonald alive and moving right before he was killed in the third avalanche with several other climbers. Both stories are equally possible, and both survivors are certain that they have the true memory of the event. Uh, Xu Jing was alone, he was in trouble, and he's openly admitted that he'd forgot most of the details, so I can definitely believe that all he really remembers is seeing a corpse, and his brain just helpfully made something up about the position the body was in. Meanwhile, Wang Hongbao probably remembered finding a body with the hole in his head, but couldn't remember exactly where the hole was, and so his brain just decided it was definitely the jeep. The entire area surrounding Wang Hongbao's 1975 camp has been thoroughly searched, and Mallory is the only old body in the area. And if Irvine died higher up, as Wang Fucho's testimony suggests, then Wang Hongbao must have found Mallory. After all, his body had no major fall damage. That wouldn't be possible if Mallory had died at 8,600 meters and then been swept down the mountain to his final resting place of 8,157. Not to mention, Smith probably spotted his corpse back in 1936, as he mentioned seeing a body in the exact spot where Mallory was found. I'm no physicist, but I don't think nature can move a dead body several hundred meters up a mountain. So, with the contradictions worked out, how could Mallory take an ice axe to the brain unless someone else swung the axe? I think it's just a simple tragedy of physics, bad luck, and a really badly placed rock. Now, as I've said, I'm not an expert, but here's my best guess about how all this went down. I think Wang Fucho's testimony is a vital part of the equation here. I trust that he was being honest. There's no reason for him to lie. He was a Chinese man speaking to Russians in the middle of the Cold War. As far as he knew, there was literally no chance that his words would reach any interested parties in the West. And besides, he was there to talk about his own successful summit journey, not the 1924 expedition. Finding a dead European man was just a side detail that he found interesting. 8,600 meters, that puts the body at the base of the second step. So, I think Irvine left his ice axe behind on the ascent, intending to retrieve it on the way back down. There was no real need for it beyond that point, and as the less experienced mountaineer, he would want his hands free and to be carrying as little weight as possible. An ice axe isn't heavy, but even a little bit is a lot up there. Two men were roped together, and on when then for whatever reason, Irvine fell from the second step. And it was a big fall, the kind that you don't get up from again. One way or another, it's deadly. If he's lucky, then Irvine would have been killed or knocked unconscious on impact. If not, then he was awake but unable to move. Rescue operations in the death zone are extremely difficult, even in the modern day. You can barely carry yourself up there, let alone another person. Carrying someone down to safety requires the efforts of at least 6 people. Mallory was an experienced mountaineer, but by the time Irvine takes his fall, Mallory's exhausted from a long day of hard climbing, seriously dehydrated from insufficient water, and now he's also injured from the rope jerk. He tries to help Irvine, but there's nothing he could possibly do. If Irvine's still alive, he can't move, and Mallory can't lift him. And if he's dead, then there's no hope anyways. Either way, there's only one thing Mallory can do. He leaves Irvine behind at 8,600 meters of elevation. Maybe Irvine's still alive at this point and still awake. He can't descend alone, and Mallory can't support him, but he still has a chance, maybe. Adele is at Camp 6, and there's more men at Camp 5. If Mallory can get there in time, maybe Irvine could hold out. So he gets Irvine to a spot that gives him a bit of shelter from the wind, and then he leaves him and promises to come back with help as soon as possible. One way or another, Irvine dies there. Maybe he quietly freezes to death waiting for help. If he was just unconscious, maybe he wakes up before the end and leaves. Or maybe he was awake and he became delirious as hypothermia set in and dragged himself out and away. Or maybe he was just gone and stayed there. Either way, Irvine dies up there, and his body is not on the immediate path of future climbers. Alone, Mallory continues descending. It's a terrible situation. His friend is hurt, if not dead, and he's left traveling relatively unfamiliar terrain, alone. He's exhausted and he's out of oxygen. Night is coming, and if it's not already there. The North Route down can be a pretty confusing descent. It's not so bad in the modern day with clear evidence of previous climbers, but having to trace an unmarked route completely by memory? It's really easy to pick the wrong path to follow, and the logical looking choices all lead you to cliff edges. So Mallory goes the wrong way and doesn't realize it till he hits a cliff. He's gotten a bit lost, but he doesn't have the time for this. Irvine's life is on the line. He's frustrated, he's angry, he's scared. He turns around and he starts trudging back up the ski slope. And then he slips. It's easy to do. I've done some mountain hiking that involves shale scrambles, and it's not easy work. And I was doing it on a clearly marked trail with the aid of a hiking pole, plenty of water, and only at about 2,000 meters of elevation. When you're up in the death zone, distracted, dehydrated, and dangerously exhausted, it would be so easy to fall. So his feet slide out from under him, and he falls forward. Mallory lands on his stomach. He begins sliding down the slope. But he's still got his ice axe, so he digs it into the hill, trying to self-arrest his fall. And then the axe hits a rock with just the wrong force at just the wrong angle, and it bounces into his forehead. This is, of course, assuming the wound was caused by an ice axe. It also could have just been a rock. In that case, he's sliding again backwards on his stomach, trying to stop himself as he picks up momentum, and then his forehead hits a rock that's jutting out. No matter how it goes, something hits Mallory's skull hard enough to punch a hole in it. His struggles stop immediately. He slides the rest of the way unimpeded and falls off the cliff. One of his legs breaks on impact. In his last few moments, the good leg covers the broken one to try and protect it. It's just an instinctive reaction to the pain. And then brain damage takes its toll and he's gone. His body stays there for 75 years, and then he's found in 1999. Hey, so if you're not cool with dead bodies, what the heck? The important step you missed is that Mallory died of head trauma after taking a fall below the first step. Well, my guess is that Irvine fell from the second step and was either killed in the fall or was hurt in a way that he couldn't descend on his own, leaving him to die of hypothermia while Mallory went for help. So, $1 million question is, did Mallory and Irvine get to the summit? Yes. I mentioned earlier that of the things Mallory was found with, his oxygen gear was totally gone, and his snow goggles were in his pocket, unbroken. That's pretty important. Remember, like, a year ago when I talked about Edward Norton being temporarily blinded and having to be carried down by 6 men? Yeah, snow blindness has been a recognized problem since the 1800s, and snow goggles are vital equipment on all of these expeditions. Mallory knew why Norton had gone blind, and he knew that it would be stupid and dangerous for him to expose himself to the same risk. If the sun was up, he would have been wearing his goggles. So the goggles being in his pocket suggests he was descending and in the dark. Though alternatively, he might have had two pairs of goggles, the spare was in his pocket, and the pair he was actually using were torn off as he took his final fall. That's absolutely possible. But the oxygen rig being gone is way more important. See, that's not the kind of thing that could be easily lost in a fall, not without the person taking way more damage that Mallory just did not have. But during the 99 expedition, Simonson found the old oxygen bottle that he'd spotted back in 1991, and they were able to confirm it as being from 1924. Mallory and Irvine were the only ones climbing with oxygen that year. The bottle was found at the base of the first step, and with the rate they were consuming oxygen, with the rate they would have consumed oxygen, the empty being discarded there suggests that they were making excellent time and their oxygen was working perfectly. So the rig being gone meant that they were out there climbing long enough to use all of their oxygen, then discard the whole thing to get rid of the extra weight. Their journey up the first step would have been pretty uneventful. On that section of the mountain, the only real challenge is the altitude, and even being an unknown territory wouldn't have been much of an obstacle. The most obvious path is also the best route, and it's used to this day. Now, the first step itself is a bit of a scramble, and it's hard going today with fixed ropes to help climbers up. Mallory and Irvine would have been doing it without that, but Mallory was one of the best climbers in the world at this point. This was a fairly simple climb for him, and not too hard to leave Irvine up it as well, so that's not a problem. At the top of the first step, they would have had a clear view of the summit, and it would have been looking so close. But they also would have seen the second step looming directly in their way. Earlier, Norton and Somerville had decided the second step was impossible to be even worth trying, which is why they'd searched for a route on the north face. Knowing that Norton's best efforts turned up nothing, Mallory and Irvine would have stayed on the ridge, willing to test their luck with the second step. Hey, maybe it's easier when you can actually see it. So, they continue on the ridge and they reach Mushroom Rock, a landmark that's considered sort of the entrance to the second step. Now they're at a bit of a tricky point. Which way do they go? This isn't even a question today, it's a clearly marked route, but again, they're working blind here. No one else has been up this far before. They don't find a path on the first try. They pick a bad route, they hit a point that's too dangerous to try, and they have to retreat. It's getting pretty late in the day now. They've been climbing for a while, their oxygen's running low, a storm's rolling in. At this point, they have no choice but to turn back. But they don't. Summit fever is a documented phenomenon. When a climber is so focused on reaching the summit, it overrules their common sense. Most climbers on most climbers that die on the upper mountain of Chomolungma, they're killed descending from the summit, having pushed forward instead of turning back while they still could. Part of this is just the effect of the death zone. It inherently impairs your judgment, and with that problem, it's easy to forget that anything exists beyond your goal. If you're half an hour away from the summit and you're told you need to turn back now because a storm's going to be there in 2 hours, it's easy to convince yourself that you can make it. It's so close, and you'll be there before the storm hits, so why not continue? You're thinking about the summit, not the deadly storm that's going to hit you about an hour and a half into your descent. The most important rule of going up a mountain is to remember you need to get yourself back down again after. Turning back at the second step is a heartbreaking decision, and one that modern climbers find incredibly hard to make. and the only pressure they experience is what they're putting on themselves. In 1924, painfully close to the summit, with the prospect of being the first people to reach it, I understand why Mallory and Irvine continued. If I was in their place, I don't know if I'd be able to turn back either. So they keep going, and they manage to find the right path up the second step. The route leading up to the final cliff is known today as the Corkscrew Chimney. It's not super difficult, but it's a very awkward climb, and apparently makes for a pretty undignified process. But, for once, Mallory and Irvine would have had an easier time than most. Modern day cold weather gear is vital equipment for reaching the summit, but it's pretty bulky stuff as a result of the effectiveness. So Mallory and Irvine aren't as warm, but their thinner clothing does give them an advantage over the modern climbers. They can actually see their own feet. This would make the Corkscrew Chimney a fairly easy climb for them. And now we're at the base of the final cliff, the worst obstacle on the entire mountain. There is no ladder, there's no fixed ropes, there's no assistance, just two men, their own skill, and their own bodies. Could Mallory have free climbed the whole thing? Maybe, yeah. Conrad Anker, the man who found his remains, performed a successful free climb of the second step with Leo Holding in 2007, and they were wearing only exact replicas of the 1924 gear. They judged that while the climb would be incredibly hard, it was just within the range of Mallory's abilities, as he was known for being incredibly skilled with technical climbing. But he wouldn't have had to climb the whole thing by himself. The cliff they're facing is about 5 meters tall, aka 16.5 feet. Working together, Mallory and Irvine could get most of the way up without having to free climb. In the 1920s, a climbing technique known as the courte échelle was well known and had been used to get over a lot of particularly tricky sections in rock climbing. Courte échelle is French, and I'm probably mangling the pronunciation something awful, and it literally translates to short ladder. The technique is done as a team. One climber stands at the base of the cliff, bracing themselves against the rock. Then the other guy uses them as a support to climb up, ending with the second climber literally standing on their partner's head. If you try to use it these days, it's going to get you laughed off the mountain. But back then, it was a perfectly legitimate method. By their powers combined, Mallory and Irvine would have been about 12 feet tall, allowing Mallory to reach the top portion of the cliff, where the grade decreases a bit and there's some natural handholds appearing. A short, dangerous climb later, and Mallory's on top of the second step. From there, it's a simple matter to just belay Irvine as he gets up the cliff behind him. The human ladder method is the exact thing the Chinese team used to get over the second step in 1960, though in their case, lead climber Yin Hua went so far as to remove his own boots and gloves to make it possible. He lost his hands and feet to frostbite, but damn if he didn't get up the cliff. So, we're on top of the second step now, and it's smooth sailing from here. The third step turns out to be a brief, hilariously easy scramble, and that carries them onto the ridge. They followed it up, and they find themselves standing at the base of a simple, gentle slope. On top of that slope is the summit. They're there. They've made it. At this point, they're either out of oxygen or they might as well be. It's suicidally late in the day, and the sun is going down. But they fucking made it. They're the first people to reach the top of the world. They take a moment to celebrate, cheering and hugging each other. They take some photos of the view and of each other for proof, and Irvine puts the camera away again. George Mallory opens the front pocket of his coat, and he removes a picture of his wife and a letter from her. He has been carrying them there since he left London, and now he can do what he's promised with them. He sets them down carefully on the summit and leaves them there. They've gotten up the mountain, but now they've got the most dangerous leg of the journey, which is getting back down again. And as I already explained, they don't. Irvine is killed descending the second step, and Mallory carries on alone before getting lost, falling to his death from a short ridge after the first step. George Mallory and Andrew Irvine are the first two to fall victim to Chomolungma's summit fever. I just want to be clear here, this should not be taken as any sort of factual explanation of their final days. I'm not an expert. I've never even been to the Himalayas, let alone Chomolungma. I'm never going to go either. My lungs are pretty bad, and I will never be able to handle high altitude climbing. So this is just my own take on things. You absolutely should not consider me to be a figure of any serious authority on the subject. This is, like, again, this is all just speculation. There's no way to know what really happened to the pair or if they actually reached the summit. It's almost been 100 years and Irvine's still missing. And so is his camera. Experts from Kodak have said that, given the conditions in the death zone, there is a chance the film might have been preserved for all this time. If it's handled very delicately upon being recovered, it might still be possible for them to develop it, finally answering the question of whether the men reached the summit or not. Now, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. This is mostly just an academic debate. After all, getting up is only half the job. It doesn't really count unless you make it back down again after. The first successful summit of Chomolungma will always be a record held by Tenzing Norgay and Sir Edmund Hillary. But it's nice to think that they did make it, you know? Mallory was deeply passionate about Chomolungma, and he'd been involved with it from the start. Mallory and Irvine truly loved that mountain. It feels right for them to have reached their goal before the end. Two of George Mallory's children, Claire and John Mallory, were still alive when his body was found. They had been aware of the expedition searching for their father, and they'd spoken with the team in advance. Claire had informed them about the letter and the photograph that her father had carried, and his promise to leave them on the summit. For her, their absence was all the proof she ever needed. They weren't on Mallory's body when they found it. So, she's. And honestly, I do agree with her. The picture and letter weren't left behind in the tent at Camp 6, and I don't believe Mallory would take them all the way there only to not leave them where he'd promised he would. To be fair, there was no sign of the letter and picture having been there when they got to the summit, but come on. We know the Chinese made the first ascent of the Tibetan route in 1960, and they left behind a small statue of Mao Zedong on the summit, but the next time someone got to the summit was in 1963, at which point the statue was already gone. It took less than 3 years for a plaster statue to completely vanish from the summit, so yeah, of course 2 pieces of paper would be long gone after 29 fucking years. John Mallory asked the expedition to bury his father where they found him, if they did find him, and that was a request that they honored. Once their investigation was concluded, they used the rocks on the slope to build a cairn over the body and interred him on the mountainside. After he was buried, they performed a brief funeral service, reading a Bible passage over his grave. While the general area he was found in is common knowledge, the team was very careful to not reveal the coordinates of his grave, to prevent his remains from being desecrated by tourists or grave robbers. Some people have attempted to locate the site anyways, but for now at least, his rest has been undisturbed. While in America in 1923, Mallory opened an interview by discussing the reasons for climbing Chomolungma. While his quip of "because it's there" is well known, he did have a more philosophical explanation, and that's a quote I'd like to share now. The first question which you will ask, and which I must try to answer, is this: what is the use of climbing Mount Everest? And my answer must be at once: it is no use. There is not the slightest prospect of any gain whatsoever. Oh, we may learn a little about the behavior of the human body at high altitudes, and possibly medical men may turn our observation to some account for the purposes of aviation, but nothing otherwise will come of it. We shall not bring back a single bit of gold or silver, not a gem, nor any coal or iron. We shall not find a single foot of earth that can be planted with crops to raise food. It's no use. So, you cannot understand that there is something in man which responds to the challenge of this mountain and goes out to meet it, that the struggle is the struggle of life itself, upward and forever upward, then you won't see why we go. What we get from this adventure is just sheer joy. And joy is, after all, the end of life. We do not live to eat and make money. We eat and make money to be able to enjoy life. That is what life means and what life is for. Okay, I have been talking for a long time now, so we're gonna take a little break here and pick this back up in episode 2. I expect to see it within a week. It's already written, I just need to rest my voice for a bit before I can get it recorded and ready to upload. Sorry about cutting this off so early here, but don't worry, we will reach the summit for real next episode. I mean, we won't get there till 1953, but this is the last expedition of the 20s. When we get back, we will have to start by just talking about why this was the last expedition of the 20s, and then we can zip right through most of the 1930s, as the four official expeditions don't do a whole lot. But there is an unofficial expedition in the 30s that will get a whole section to itself. It's worth it, trust me. It's amazing. It's like the exact opposite of Mallory and Irvine's story. A guy dies, his body is found the next year, there's literally no fucking way he could have gotten near the summit, and the whole saga is completely hilarious. Trust me, you are not prepared to learn how bat fuck wild this guy's plans were. Whatever you're thinking, you're wrong. It was so much worse. Just consider that your teaser for next week. Anyways, apart from that, the expeditions of the 30s go past, and then some other stuff starts happening in Europe, and everyone very quickly has a whole lot of problems that don't really involve mountain climbing. So, as far as we're concerned, basically nothing happened in the 40s. We get exactly one brief solo expedition from an admittedly cool guy, and then we're on to the 50s and on to the top. Thank you for joining me so far, and I hope you will tune in again for the next episode. Special thanks to Jake Norton, who was a member of the Mallory and Irvine research expedition, and he shared his own analysis of their final climb. There's links in the summary there's links to his summary in the description, and I encourage everyone to read it. My own theory was heavily based off of his, and includes his own photography and video from the locations he is referring to, as well as his own first-hand perspective of having actually done the process of climbing each section. The only real difference between his summary and mine is that I'm accounting for the Leningrad testimony, which was not common knowledge at the time his theory was posted. I agree completely with his analysis of their ascent. I only diverged when it came to the descent and their deaths. The description should also have a link to my Tumblr, which you should follow if you want to see cat pictures, memes, terrible jokes, and occasionally me talking about this podcast. If you want to know more about something, just ask. I will be 4 paragraphs deep before I realize you have tricked me into info dumping. We're rolling into summer here in the Northern Hemisphere, so everyone make sure to wear sunscreen, especially if you are basically immune to sunburn like I am. I can assure you, we're not immune to skin cancer. And remember, everyone, hydrate or die straight.